sat on the floor of her modest apartment, the soft hum of jazz playing from her Bluetooth speaker while ribbons and wrapping paper lay scattered across her carpet. The scent of lavender from a nearby candle filled the air as she carefully placed bath salts, scented candles, a bottle of wine, and a handwritten card into the cream-colored bridal gift box. Her fingers worked with precision, but her heart felt distant. This was supposed to be a joyful moment. Her best friend Agnes was getting married, and Ruth, ever the loyal friend, was helping coordinate the bridal shower. But as she tied the final bow on the box, her chest ached. No matter how much time passed, preparing anything wedding-related still reminded her of the life she once imagined, with Jeremy. 2 years had passed, yet the wound hadn't fully healed. She ran her hand over the ribbon and whispered, "Stop it, Ruth. This isn't about you." She stood up and glanced at the framed photo of her and Agnes on her bookshelf. They were teenagers in that photo, fresh-faced and full of dreams. Back then, they'd promised to stand by each other's side through every milestone. Ruth smiled faintly, remembering how Agnes had comforted her during her darkest days after her breakup with Jeremy. Agnes had been the rock, the one who brought her soup, listened without judgment, and reminded her she still had a future. Now it was Ruth's turn to show up for her. She picked up her phone and texted, "Bridal shower gift ready. Can't wait to celebrate you." Seconds later, Agnes replied with excitement, "You're the best. Couldn't do this without you. See you soon, Ruthie." Ruth stared at the screen for a moment. Something in that message stirred discomfort, but she shook it off. "You're just being emotional," she told herself. She placed the gift by the door and went to her wardrobe to pick out a dress for the party. Still, as she held a pale blue gown against her body, she couldn't ignore the dull throb in her heart, the same ache that had haunted her every time Jeremy crossed her mind. And now, she was helping her best friend walk into a future Ruth had once dreamed would be hers. University life had been a whirlwind for Ruth, late night studying, hurried morning coffees, and dreams that danced just out of reach. But in the middle of all the chaos, Jeremy walked into her life like a soft interruption. He wasn't flashy or the loudest voice in the room, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only one who mattered. They met during a group presentation in their final year, paired randomly by a professor with poor memory and great timing. What started as mild conversations about literature and politics soon turned into long walks after class and hours of phone calls that bled into morning light. Jeremy brought her homemade meals when she skipped dinner, and she introduced him to gospel jazz. He once told her, "Ruth, you calm the noise in my head. I didn't know I needed quiet until I met you." It was that moment she knew she was falling. Their relationship grew effortlessly. Friends began referring to them as the couple who already looked married, and Ruth embraced the comfort that came with that stability. Jeremy was intentional. He remembered her favorite tea, bought her flowers without reason, and never missed calling her goodnight. They talked about life after school, getting a small apartment in Akeja, Jeremy starting his political internship, and Ruth opening her own boutique someday. One evening, as they sat under a campus tree eating suya, Jeremy reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny silver ring from a street vendor. "It's not real," he said with a sheepish grin, "but one day I'll get you one that is." Ruth had laughed and slipped it onto her finger. "As long as it's you, I'll wait," she whispered. And for a time, it felt like she had found something lasting. They were each other's home in a world that kept shifting. But what Ruth didn't see then, what she couldn't have known, was that the solid ground beneath them would begin to crack long before the goodbye ever came. And even now, years later, those memories still lived in her like stubborn ghosts that refused to fade. The first sign that something had changed came quietly. It wasn't an argument or a betrayal, just a silence where there used to be warmth. Jeremy became consumed with a new internship at a senator's office, his time swallowed up by meetings, press events, and late-night policy reviews. At first, Ruth was understanding. "You're building something big," she encouraged him. But the unanswered texts and missed calls slowly replaced the thoughtful gestures she once cherished. One evening, Ruth waited 3 hours at a restaurant for their anniversary dinner. When Jeremy finally showed up, disheveled and distracted, all he said was, "Let's just eat. I'm tired." She didn't cry that night, but something in her shifted. She felt unseen. And the man who once looked at her like she was everything now barely met her eyes. Their arguments began subtly and grew sharper with time. Ruth would ask simple questions like, "Do you still want this?" And Jeremy would shrug, "Why are you always reading into things?" She felt herself shrinking, second-guessing her worth in the relationship. One Saturday morning, after a tense week of avoidance, Ruth brought it up again while they were cleaning. "Are you even happy anymore?" she asked softly. Jeremy didn't look up from his phone. "Ruth, not everything needs a conversation. Can we just live?" The sentence stung more than she expected. That night, as they lay in bed back to back, Ruth stared into the darkness and realized she couldn't feel him beside her anymore. They were sharing space, but no longer sharing hearts. What was once love had become routine. And in the middle of that disconnection, Agnes began to visit more often, dropping by with food, sitting beside Ruth during her tears, and offering comfort that felt too timely. But Ruth never questioned her. Agnes had always been her safe place. She couldn't imagine a world where that would change. It was a rainy Friday when Ruth finally broke. She stood at the doorway, watching Jeremy pace the room on yet another call while his packed weekend bag sat by the door. He was supposed to spend the weekend with her, just them, but another urgent retreat had come up. "You always have an excuse," she muttered. Jeremy paused, pulled the phone away from his ear, and asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" Ruth's voice cracked. "I mean, you haven't chosen me in months, Jeremy. You're here, but not really. Are you even in this relationship anymore?" He stared at her, emotionless. "I'm doing what I need to do for my future, Ruth. You should try understanding that." The words cut like glass. She felt small, invisible, angry. "Then maybe you should go find someone who understands you," she snapped. She regretted it immediately, but Jeremy didn't argue. He grabbed his bag and left. Days passed, then weeks. Ruth waited for him to return to call, to fight for them. She told herself he needed time to cool off, that he'd come back when he realized what they had. But he didn't, not a single word. Agnes came by more often during this period, helping Ruth eat, sleep, and pick up the shattered pieces of her confidence. "Maybe it's for the best," Agnes said gently one evening. "Maybe he wasn't ready for you." Ruth had cried in her arms, clinging to the friend who had always stood by her. But something about Jeremy's silence never sat right. It wasn't just absence, it was abandonment. She had ended it with words she didn't mean, expecting resistance, expecting love to fight back. But Jeremy had walked away without looking back. She kept hoping for closure, for a conversation, for anything. Instead, all she got was quiet. And in that quiet, Ruth slowly began the painful process of accepting a goodbye that didn't feel finished. A goodbye that would come back one day, but not in the way she ever expected. Ruth stopped checking her phone after the third month. The days had begun to blur, stitched together by the quiet hum of survival. Her apartment became her cave, a space of muted routines and soft-spoken loneliness. Agnes became her anchor through it all, never missing a weekend visit. "You're stronger than you think," she'd say, bringing her ice cream or lighting scented candles around the house. Ruth tried to believe her. Still, something inside her had broken, something that hadn't yet found the courage to heal. On some evenings, Ruth would stare at the ceiling, wondering what she'd done wrong. She'd reread old conversations, looking for the turning point. "Was it me?" she once whispered into the dark, her voice fragile. But the silence always answered back. At work, Ruth threw herself into long shifts and after-hours assignments. She stopped attending weddings, birthdays, and anything that hinted at romance. But Agnes always stayed close, texting daily, organizing brunch dates, and urging Ruth to take walks when her depression thickened. "Let's go to the market," Agnes would insist, dragging her into sunlight. Ruth appreciated it. Agnes was more than a friend. She was a refuge. During one of their kitchen chats, Ruth opened up for the first time in weeks. "I don't miss him," she said, biting into a slice of bread. "I just miss who I was with him. I don't know who I am now." Agnes leaned over and placed her hand on hers. "You're still her, Ruth. You just forgot for a little while. But I haven't forgotten." That moment stitched something fragile back together in Ruth. She didn't know that the same hands that comforted her were already hiding a truth sharp enough to tear her open again. 2 years quietly slipped by, each day layered atop the last with careful symmetry. Ruth no longer cried when she passed couples in the park or when she saw rings in jewelry shop windows. Her heart had learned how to ache quietly, how to keep beat without complaint. She worked at a local design company as a product coordinator, managing schedules and overseeing small launches. Her boss adored her for her precision. "Ruth," he once joked during a team meeting, "if you were a machine, you'd never glitch." She smiled, but she knew her real talent wasn't efficiency, it was avoidance. She buried herself in productivity because she feared what might surface in stillness. Her social circle had grown smaller, intentionally so. Agnes remained her one constant, dropping in at least once a week with pastries or a new nail color to try. "You need to be ready," she teased once. "For what?" Ruth asked, puzzled. "For life. It's not over," Agnes grinned. Ruth only shrugged. She didn't tell her that she didn't feel like life had started again. Every time she thought about love, she felt a deep unease, an invisible bruise she didn't know how to treat. Gloria, a coworker with sharp wit and observant eyes, had once nudged Ruth about dating again. "You ever think about moving on?" Gloria asked one Friday over lunch. "From what?" Ruth had replied. "You never told me what really ended." Gloria tilted her head. "Exactly. That's why I'm asking." Ruth only smiled, her silence saying more than words could. She wasn't ready to explain what she never fully understood, because in the quiet of that ending, there were questions she still didn't know how to ask or answer. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when Agnes barged into Ruth's apartment, a champagne bottle in hand and an oversized grin stretching across her face. "I'm getting married," she squealed. Ruth blinked, momentarily stunned before forcing herself to smile. "What? Oh my God, Aggie, that's amazing." Agnes twirled in the center of the room, holding out her hand to reveal a modest but elegant diamond ring. "He proposed last night," she said, eyes gleaming. Ruth hugged her tightly, the warmth in her arms real, but her mind already circling. "Who is he?" she asked as they sat down. Agnes waved a dismissive hand. "You'll meet him soon." "I want it to be a surprise," Ruth laughed. "You? Keeping secrets? Since when?" Agnes leaned in. "Since now. It'll be worth it, I promise." Over the next few days, Agnes buzzed with excitement. Wedding magazines piled up on Ruth's table, and the two friends stayed up late making bridal vision boards. "I want blush tones," Agnes mused one night, flipping through fabric swatches. "Soft and romantic, something timeless." Ruth nodded, jotting notes. "What about the groom's suit? Navy or charcoal?" Agnes smiled but didn't answer. Ruth found the silence strange. Every mention of the groom was met with vague nods or cheeky deflections. "He's private," Agnes would say, "but trust me, you'll love him." Ruth tried to shake the weirdness, telling herself Agnes was just playing up the mystery. Still, something about it bothered her. She thought of all the nights they'd shared secrets and heartbreaks. Why hide his name now? She didn't push, though. After all, Agnes had been there for her when no one else was. She had earned her trust, hadn't she? Ruth paced slowly through the candle aisle of a home store, her phone pressed to her ear as Agnes rattled off bridal shower checklist items. "Don't forget the pastel balloons, peach, not pink," Agnes instructed. Ruth chuckled. "You're more precise than a wedding planner." But as the call continued, Ruth steered the conversation again toward the topic that had lingered in her mind for days. "So, will I finally get to meet the mysterious man before the wedding day?" There was a pause. Then Agnes laughed too quickly. "I told you, Ruth, I want it to be a surprise. Just wait a little longer." Ruth frowned, picking up a candle and setting it back down. "We've shared everything, Aggie. Why hide his name like it's state security?" Agnes dodged. "You'll understand when you see him. It's complicated, but beautiful." That phrase, complicated but beautiful, stuck with Ruth. At the office later that week, she relayed the interaction to Gloria, who raised a brow over her salad bowl. "Are you sure she's okay? That's weird, Ruth." Ruth shrugged, swirling her tea. "Maybe she's just being dramatic. You know how Agnes loves surprises." Gloria leaned in, voice quieter. "Or maybe she doesn't want to say because it's someone she knows you'd react to." The thought chilled Ruth, but she quickly shook it off. No, not Agnes. Still a seed had been planted. In the quiet moments after work, Ruth found herself scrolling through old social media posts, Agnes photos from months past, trying to trace anyone new. But there was nothing. The groom, whoever he was, seemed to exist outside the digital world. That absence only deepened Ruth's unease. For the first time in years, she felt like Agnes wasn't fully hers anymore, like their sisterhood had begun to fracture under the weight of an untold truth. The guest list arrived in Ruth's inbox with an excited note from Agnes. Bridesmaid duties begin now. Let me know if you see anyone I missed. Love you. Ruth opened the attachment with a smile that quickly faltered. She scrolled past familiar names, college friends, co-workers, distant cousins, until one jumped out at her, Steve Olanrawaju, Jeremy's cousin. Her breath caught, and she read it again, hoping her eyes had lied. But it was clear. Steve, the same cousin who used to visit them when she and Jeremy were still together, was on the list. Why would he be there? She muttered. She opened her chat with Agnes. Hey babe, random question. What's Steve doing on the guest list? Moments later, a reply. Oh, he's bringing something for the venue. He works in event logistics now. No biggie. No biggie. The words looped in Ruth's head long after the conversation ended. That night, she dreamed of Jeremy, standing at a doorway, staring at her like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. When she awoke, her chest was tight with unease. At the bridal shower venue the next day, Ruth arrived early to help set up. As she arranged flowers in the dining room, she heard the front door open and turned. There stood Steve, taller than she remembered, carrying a small box and clipboard. Ruth, he said, clearly surprised. Hey, it's been a while. Ruth forced a polite smile. Yeah, it has. Didn't expect to see you here. He nodded. Agnes said you'd be helping. Small world. They exchanged a few words before he excused himself. But the way his eyes darted, the tension in his voice, it was off. And Ruth could feel it in her gut. Something wasn't adding up. Steve hadn't even mentioned Jeremy. Not even once. And knowing their history, that silence felt too deliberate. The sun beamed through the sheer curtains of the decorated sitting room as guests began to arrive, laughter and perfume filling the air. Ruth floated between groups with a smile, her navy bridesmaid dress flowing as she refilled wine glasses and passed around name tags. This is perfect, Ruth, one of the guests whispered as they took in the pastel backdrop and rose gold signage. Ruth nodded, but inside she was scattered, half present, half watching. Watching Agnes, watching Steve. Watching for what exactly? She didn't know. She only felt it in her chest, like standing at the edge of something she couldn't name. Agnes, meanwhile, was glowing. She laughed with ease, her movements practiced, her eyes dancing with excitement. You really outdid yourself, she said, pulling Ruth aside for a quick hug. This is the happiest I've ever been. Ruth held the hug a moment longer than expected. I'm glad, she said, her voice flat. Agnes tilted her head. You okay? Ruth blinked. Just tired. Long day. But the lie itched in her throat. As the bridal games began, truth or dare, wedding trivia, dress design competitions, Ruth smiled through it all, clapping and laughing at all the right moments. But she watched. Every time someone mentioned the groom, Agnes deflected with jokes or quickly changed the subject. And no one questioned it. No one but Ruth. As the party wound down, Ruth helped clean up while the others chatted over drinks in the living room. Ruth, go rest, Agnes called. You've done too much. Ruth nodded and headed down the hallway toward the guest room. But something, curiosity, intuition, something else, told her not to close her eyes that night. So she lay still, curled on the bed, breathing slow, waiting, listening. And what she was about to hear would break her heart all over again. The muffled sound of laughter drifted through the hallway, followed by the clinking of wine glasses and shuffling feet. Ruth lay still on the guest bed, one arm under her pillow, her eyes closed but her ears fully alert. The games had ended over an hour ago, but the after-party energy lingered in the air. A couple of the women had clearly drunk more than their fill, and the chatter had turned from organized fun to careless gossip. Ruth recognized Sharon's voice, quiet and hesitant, as she asked a question that Ruth couldn't quite make out. Then came Agnes's louder reply, slurred slightly but unmistakably confident. Please, Agnes laughed. If you knew what I've done to get here, you'd call me a villain. Another chorus of giggles followed. Someone asked, "Are you going to tell her?" To which Agnes responded, "She's asleep. She doesn't know anything. She'll never know." Ruth's chest tightened as she kept still, her breathing slow and measured. They were talking about her. There was no mistaking it. The air felt thick, like the walls themselves were leaning in to eavesdrop. A glass clinked hard against a surface, followed by another outburst of laughter. "Imagine if she found out now," someone teased. The look on her face, Agnes giggled again. "It's better this way. We're too close to the wedding. She's happy for me, and that's what matters. The past is the past." Ruth felt like her body was made of stone, every muscle taut, her heart thudding like a warning bell. She wanted to move, to rise and confront them, but something stronger held her in place, an instinct, a deeper need to know everything before speaking. This wasn't just gossip. This was the beginning of something unraveling, and Ruth wasn't going to miss a word. Ruth listened as the voices outside grew bolder with each passing minute. Someone turned on music faintly in the background, soft Afro-soul beats underscoring the careless conversations now spilling from the wine-heavy mouths of women she once trusted. Sharon again asked hesitantly, "So, how long were you guys, together?" A pause. Then Agnes's voice dropped to a half-drunken whisper that still echoed like thunder to Ruth. The moment Ruth ended it with him, "I didn't wait. I knew she was done. And I wasn't about to let a good thing go to waste." Gasps and squeals followed. "Agnes, you're wicked," someone giggled. Agnes replied, almost smugly, she shouldn't have thrown him away if she wanted him so badly. Another girl asked, "So, you two were already talking when they were still together?" And Agnes gave a low laugh. "Emotionally, maybe. But physically, I waited, just barely." Every word sank into Ruth's spine like frost. Her fists clenched under the blanket, nails biting into her palm. The betrayal wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A series of deliberate, calculated steps taken behind her back while she cried into Agnes' arms, trusting her blindly. The conversations outside shifted toward Jeremy now. One woman asked, "And he's okay with her being at the wedding?" Agnes replied confidently, "He knows I've handled it. Ruth's harmless. Besides, she thinks we met through Steve just last year." The room exploded in laughter again. "Wow. So, you're really going to let her stand up there beside you? Knowing all this?" a voice asked, tone laced with disbelief. "Of course," Agnes responded smoothly. "She already lost him. She just doesn't know how." Ruth turned her face into the pillow, swallowing a sharp cry. The bed, once a resting place, had become a prison of truth. And the more they spoke, the more the illusion of sisterhood shattered into shards she could never piece together again. Ruth remained frozen, every nerve alight with disbelief and cold fury. Her eyes blinked open, but her body stayed motionless under the weight of what she'd heard. They were no longer just careless whispers. These were confessions, loud and unashamed, from the woman she had trusted more than anyone else. Agnes, the same Agnes who had held her while she mourned Jeremy, had not only crossed a line, she had orchestrated it. She hadn't stumbled into love with Jeremy. She had waited, watched, and pounced. And now she was getting rewarded with a wedding and a carefully curated lie, while Ruth was expected to clap, smile, and raise a toast. As another wave of laughter erupted outside, Ruth quietly rose from the bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cool tiled floor. She cracked the door just slightly, enough to glimpse the glow of fairy lights in the living room and the women huddled together on the couch. Agnes sat in the center, glass in hand, face flushed from wine and victory. "This is the life I was meant to live," she said to them, eyes dreamy. "I fought for it." Sharon, who seemed more sober than the rest, replied cautiously. But Ruth, she never suspected? Agnes shook her head. "She's too sentimental to see people clearly. She believed I was mourning with her. But I was already planning my future." Ruth closed the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. Her heart beat like a drum inside her chest, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was a strange, simmering clarity. The kind that doesn't make a sound until it's ready to roar. The voices outside dulled for a moment, and Ruth thought maybe the night was finally ending, until she heard it. Clear and bold, without hesitation, Agnes said his name. "Jeremy." Ruth's heart clenched. Honestly, Jeremy is the best thing that's ever happened to me, Agnes declared. I don't regret any of it. I just regret how long I had to pretend. One of the girls whistled, You're savage. Agnes laughed. He's mine now. Ruth let him go. I just picked up what she threw away. Another chimed in, But didn't they date for like 5 years? Agnes replied with a shrug in her tone. They did, but he told me he always felt Ruth was holding him back. I gave him freedom. I gave him a future. Ruth's breath hitched. The man she once loved, whose dreams she nurtured, whose meals she cooked, whose fears she prayed over, was now being spoken of like a prize, by the one person she once believed would shield her from harm. The wine had stripped away every filter in the room. What started as whispers had become bold confessions. The betrayal didn't just sting, it rewrote Ruth's memories. Agnes had been with her through it all, but now Ruth saw it differently. The lingering glances, the subtle deflections whenever Jeremy's name came up after the breakup. Even the overly enthusiastic comfort sessions like Agnes had rehearsed them. Ruth's throat was dry. Everything inside her wanted to storm into the living room, to scream, to break glasses, and demand the truth to her face. But another part, calmer, sharper, held her back. This wasn't the moment to react. It was the moment to learn, to see. She had lost Jeremy once, but losing Agnes like this? It cut deeper, because this wasn't a love lost. This was a war disguised as friendship. And tonight, Ruth finally saw who had been waging it in secret. The room grew quiet as some guests began to doze off, their laughter dissolving into scattered yawns. But Ruth's mind was wide awake, gripped by a storm that refused to settle. Lying in the dark, she replayed Agnes' words over and over. I knew she was done. He's mine now. She's too sentimental. Each phrase crashed like waves, drowning her in clarity. Agnes hadn't just betrayed her. She had studied her, waited for her weakest moment, and struck. Ruth finally understood this wasn't accidental, this was engineered. Agnes had carefully inserted herself where she didn't belong, all while masking her ambition as concern. And now she was days away from marrying the very man Ruth had once imagined forever with. Ruth sat up slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. Her eyes were dry, but her soul felt drenched in grief. Not for Jeremy, no, that part of her heart had long stopped bleeding, but for the friendship she thought was unshakable. She thought of every vulnerable moment she'd handed Agnes, every tear, every late-night call, every memory now tainted. She rose from the bed, walked to the bathroom quietly, and splashed cold water on her face. Looking into the mirror, she whispered, You'll survive this, but not like before. She didn't want to just endure. She wanted justice, not rage, not a dramatic confrontation. She wanted truth laid bare where it would sting the most. She would let Agnes have her moment. Let her walk to that altar and believe the war was won. And then Ruth would reveal what had been hidden when it would hurt most. Not because she was cruel, but because she deserved to look her in the eye and say, I heard everything. By dawn, the house was quiet. Empty wine glasses and lipstick-stained napkins littered the living room like forgotten confessions. Ruth emerged from the guest room looking composed, maybe even radiant. Her dress was neatly ironed, her braids swept back into a bun, and her voice was calm as she greeted the remaining guests. Morning, she said gently, offering Sharon a smile. Sharon blinked, rubbing her eyes. You're up early, Ruth chuckled. I never really slept. She made breakfast while the others stirred lazily, pretending nothing had shifted. Agnes came into the kitchen in her silk robe, stretching and yawning. You're amazing, Ruth. I hope I'm half as strong as you when I'm married. Ruth stirred the tea and replied, I'm sure you'll be just fine. But beneath her steady voice, her heart beat with a quiet defiance. The performance had begun. When Ruth finally left the house, the sun was bright, but her soul was overcast. She walked to the car with her head high, smiling at Agnes, who waved from the doorway. Thanks for everything, Agnes called. You're truly one of a kind. Ruth nodded, shutting her car door. I know, she muttered to herself. As she drove, memories of the night echoed, each word carved into her like a scar. But there was no room for grief now. Not yet. She needed clarity, evidence, and a strategy. Back at home, Ruth sat at her kitchen table and began writing. Names, dates, questions, timeline gaps. She knew what she'd heard, but now she had to prove it. Not just for herself, But for everyone who had been fooled by the perfect love story, Agnes and Jeremy were parading around. This time, Ruth would not be caught sleeping. The corner of Ruth's closet held a box she hadn't touched in over a year. It was labeled Jeremy, scrawled hastily on the side in black marker, the only attempt she made to compartmentalize what once was. For months, she couldn't bring herself to open it. But now, with the truth unraveling in pieces, she reached for it with steady hands. Sitting on the floor, she peeled the lid back to reveal old photos, handwritten notes, ticket stubs from movie dates, and a journal she used to keep during their relationship. She wasn't searching for nostalgia. She was hunting for alignment, any overlap between Jeremy and Agnes that had once seemed harmless. Ruth flipped through pages, landing on one entry dated just 2 weeks before the breakup. Agnes stopped by after our argument. She stayed late again. I'm grateful, but sometimes I wonder why she doesn't ask more questions. She paused, heart tightening. There were photos, too, group shots where Jeremy and Agnes stood closer than she remembered. Her eyes now scanned every touch, every glance, with fresh suspicion. A birthday dinner at Jeremy's apartment caught her attention. She remembered being ill that week. Agnes had brought her soup and insisted she rest while she handled everything. Ruth had stayed home, sick in bed, while her best friend hosted a dinner in her boyfriend's space. The pieces began to form a quiet picture, subtle enough to miss, damning enough to expose. She opened her laptop and began transferring evidence. Scans of journal pages, timestamps from photos, and old messages from group chats that Agnes had once orchestrated. Ruth whispered aloud as she typed, "You didn't just steal him, Agnes. You rehearsed it." And with each digital folder she created, the ache in her chest transformed into resolve. Her pain was no longer a wound. It was fuel. That Monday, Ruth met Gloria at a quiet cafe tucked behind their office building. Gloria arrived with her usual confidence, sunglasses perched atop her head, scarf wrapped elegantly around her neck. "You sounded serious on the phone," she said, sliding into the booth. Ruth didn't waste time. She pulled out her tablet and laid it flat on the table, screen already displaying the first set of images. "Gloria, I need you to look at these. Tell me if you remember anything odd." Gloria leaned in, her brow furrowing as she scanned through the photos. Then she froze. "Wait, this one," she pointed. "That was your anniversary week, right? Why was Agnes with him alone?" Ruth nodded, lips tight. "I was sick. She told me she just went to drop off a gift." Gloria's face darkened. "Ruth, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cause drama. But back then, I noticed things too. The way she mentioned Jeremy a little too much at work, how she always had something to say about his career, like she knew more than you shared." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Gloria hesitated. "Because you were already hurting. And honestly, I didn't want to believe it myself. But now, all of this." She tapped the screen. "It's a pattern." Ruth leaned back in the booth, inhaling slowly. "I need to be sure. I need facts. Not just feelings." Gloria reached across the table. "Then let's dig. If she left a trail, we'll find it." The words gave Ruth a jolt of courage. Agnes had counted on secrecy and sentimentality. But now Ruth had Gloria, and the truth was gaining momentum. Ruth sat across from Nelson at a small restaurant they used to frequent during university days. He had aged slightly, less hair, more beard, but his warm demeanor hadn't changed. "It's good to see you, Ruth," he smiled, sipping his drink. "It's been too long," she nodded. "It has. I've actually been meaning to ask you something." Nelson tilted his head, curious. "Ask away." Ruth hesitated, then handed him her phone, showing an old photo from a house party. "This was your place, right?" He peered closer. "Yeah, my graduation send-off. Why?" Ruth's voice lowered. "Do you remember how long Jeremy and Agnes stayed that night? Were they together at any point?" Nelson rubbed his chin. "Now that you mention it, I saw them talking outside for a while. Just the two of them. Thought nothing of it back then." Ruth's heart pounded, though her face remained neutral. "And after my breakup with Jeremy, how soon did you hear about him moving on?" Nelson leaned back, trying to recall. "It was pretty quick. A few weeks maybe. I didn't know who it was, though. No one said." Ruth nodded slowly, concealing the confirmation burning through her. "Thanks, Nelson. That helps more than you know." He looked at her, concern creeping into his expression. "Ruth, is something wrong?" She forced a soft smile. "Let's just say I've been blind for a long time. But I'm done pretending now." As they wrapped up their meal, Ruth felt the final puzzle pieces slipping into place. Nelson hadn't known it, but he had just validated the timeline. Agnes hadn't waited. Jeremy hadn't wandered. They had crossed lines while she was still bleeding. And now, Ruth had everything she needed to show the world who they truly were. The evening sky was a dark slate when Ruth returned home, her laptop already open before she even removed her shoes. She had spent the entire cab ride replaying Nelson's words. It wasn't speculation anymore, it was confirmation. The timeline Agnes had presented publicly was a lie, a carefully constructed version of events designed to silence questions. Ruth pulled up her saved files, opening one tab after another. Her notes were organized now, color-coded screenshots, voice memos from Gloria, and journal excerpts tagged by date. Every piece pointed to one truth. Agnes and Jeremy hadn't found each other after heartbreak. They had created hers to justify theirs. Ruth stared at a photo from 6 months before her breakup, Agnes and Jeremy standing shoulder to shoulder at a political fundraiser. Jeremy's hand hovered too closely at her waist. At the time, Ruth had dismissed it. But now it looked like a silent confession. She called Gloria. "I need a second opinion on these," Ruth said. "There are too many contradictions in their story." Gloria arrived within the hour, tossing her purse on the couch as she clicked through the evidence. "They were playing you in plain sight," she muttered. "This post," she pointed to a smiling picture of Agnes and Jeremy at a restaurant Ruth never visited. He commented, "My piece." And the date? It was before your final fight. Ruth clenched her jaw. "She said they met through Steve last year." Gloria nodded. "Then why does Steve tag them together on a post from 2 years ago?" Ruth leaned back, the weight of the truth pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the effort they both took to erase her side of the story. They didn't just fall in love. They rewrote history to make her look like a faded background character in their fairy tale. But Ruth wasn't going to stay silent anymore. "It's time," she said, "we give this story a new ending." The days that followed were quiet but calculating. Ruth moved through work and daily routines with the same poised calm she was known for, but her evenings became war rooms of planning. Gloria helped design a digital timeline, one that detailed her relationship with Jeremy alongside the moments Agnes had claimed as her own. They laid it out like a case file, photos, voice notes, receipts, and public posts. Ruth didn't want vengeance born of rage. She wanted exposure born of facts. "The truth is enough," she told Gloria one night. "If they chose to build love on lies, I'll just remove the veil. The rest will collapse on its own." Gloria, ever pragmatic, replied, "Good. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. Some people will act like you're the villain just for telling the truth." Ruth had already prepared for that. The truth was never convenient, especially when people had already chosen who to clap for. She reached out to an old acquaintance who worked in media relations, Shola, a woman with sharp instincts and a deep dislike for hypocrisy. Ruth forwarded her the evidence. "This isn't gossip," she messaged. "This is a timeline collapse hidden under a wedding veil." Shola responded almost immediately. "Meet me Thursday. I want names and context. If I run this, I do it clean," Ruth agreed. As the wedding drew closer, her emotions fluctuated, one moment trembling with sorrow for everything she had lost, the next grounded by the weight of the truth she now carried. She wasn't Ruth the broken-hearted anymore. She was Ruth the witness. And when the time came, she wouldn't raise her voice. She would raise the curtain. Gloria's office became their safe house. The lights dimmed, blinds drawn, they pinned photos and documents on a corkboard like detectives hunting down a suspect. But in this case, the suspects were smiling in matching outfits on save-the-date cards. "Look at this," Gloria said, highlighting a message thread from 2 years ago. Agnes had texted Ruth, saying she was staying in that evening. Yet, a geotagged photo showed her at the same restaurant Jeremy had once taken Ruth on their 3rd anniversary. "It's subtle," Ruth whispered, but she was always watching, mimicking the things that made us special. Gloria nodded. "She didn't just steal your man. She studied your blueprint." Every new inconsistency they uncovered confirmed what Ruth had suspected. This wasn't love. It was ambition dressed as romance. They printed everything: color photos, message screenshots, time-stamped emails, and location logs. Ruth assembled it into a binder labeled "For the Record." Inside was everything she wished someone had warned her about. She also composed a letter, firm but measured, explaining her silence, her heartbreak, and the reality Agnes and Jeremy never thought she'd piece together. The plan wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. Ruth scheduled the release to align with the rehearsal dinner weekend, ensuring the fallout couldn't be ignored or delayed. "Are you sure about this?" Gloria asked one last time. Ruth looked down at the binder in her lap, her voice calm. "I've lived in their lie long enough. I'm not burning their house down. I'm just turning on the lights." And with that, Ruth stood, taller than she had in years. The wedding buzz had taken over every corner of social media. Agnes' bridal portraits began to circulate. Soft focus shots of her smiling coyly behind a lace veil, carefully posed with tulips in hand, tagged with captions like, "Forever starts now." Ruth scrolled past them with a detached gaze, each post another reminder of the illusion Agnes had mastered. But it wasn't until she read a headline on a local blog that something inside her stirred deeper. "Meet Jeremy and Agnes, Lagos' new power couple." The article described Jeremy as a rising political strategist with clean values and Agnes as his graceful bride-to-be, who had supported his growth from the shadows. Ruth nearly laughed aloud. From the shadows? Agnes had waited in the shadows, yes, but only to strike when the light hit just right. Determined to trace the public narrative, Ruth researched Jeremy's recent political affiliations and found that his name had quietly entered conversations surrounding an upcoming youth development bill. This wasn't just about love anymore. This wedding was part of a brand. A campaign. A clean, curated image sold to the public like a romance novel, perfect, pure, and patriotic. "He needs this wedding," Ruth muttered to herself. "And she needs the applause." But Ruth had something neither of them anticipated, a truth sharp enough to cut through tulle and tuxedos. She reached out to Shola again. "The story runs the morning of the wedding," Ruth instructed. "If anyone asks, let them know I simply responded with facts. No embellishments." Shola responded with a single message: "Done. Let the audience decide who the real bride is." Ruth drafted a private message to 6 carefully selected media professionals. Each envelope included the timeline binder, digital evidence on a USB stick, and a personal note: "This is not a scandal. This is a story of silence, loyalty, and what people do when they think no one is watching." She didn't write it with bitterness. She wrote it with precision. Gloria watched as she sealed the last one. "You're steady," Gloria said, impressed. "Most people would be ranting or crying." Ruth looked up. "That's what Agnes is counting on, that I'll fall apart or stay quiet. But I won't give her either." Gloria exhaled deeply. "Then she has no idea what's coming." That evening, Ruth delivered each package in person, walking into media houses without hesitation. She didn't hide. She didn't flinch. One journalist, Keen, reviewed the folder immediately, his eyes widening. "Are you serious?" he asked. This changes everything." Ruth nodded calmly. "I'm not here to destroy anyone. I just want the truth to speak louder than the lies they rehearsed." Keen looked up. "This story will go viral." Ruth smiled faintly. "Then let it. I've lived my part of it in silence for too long." By the time she returned home, she knew the countdown had begun. In 48 hours, Agnes would walk toward Jeremy at the altar. But this time, she wouldn't be the only one with a surprise waiting. The bridal boutique buzzed with anticipation. Tulle and satin fabrics draped across mirrors, and the scent of fresh roses filled the room. Ruth arrived on time, her posture as graceful as ever, her expression unreadable. "There she is!" Agnes chirped, stepping out of the dressing room in a shimmering off-white gown. "My bridesmaid of life. Tell me I don't look like a queen." Ruth nodded slowly. "You look like a woman who's gotten everything she ever wanted." Agnes laughed, oblivious to the layered truth in Ruth's words. "You always know how to make me feel seen," she gushed. "You've been with me through it all. Honestly, Ruth, I don't think I'd be here without you." Ruth held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "You're right," she whispered. "You wouldn't be." As the seamstress adjusted the bodice, The other bridesmaids chatted about honeymoon locations and bridal hairstyles. Agnes leaned close and whispered, "After the wedding, I have a big announcement. Jeremy and I might be launching a foundation together. Can you believe it?" Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Wow, that's ambitious." Agnes beamed. "We're a power team. I just hope I haven't made you feel left behind." Ruth smiled faintly, her voice low. "You didn't leave me behind, Agnes. You just thought I'd never catch up." Agnes tilted her head, confused, but Ruth was already walking toward the dressing room to change. As she zipped up her dress, her reflection stared back, steadier, sharper, untouchable. The final fitting wasn't just for a gown. It was the last rehearsal before the curtain lifted on the show Agnes thought she'd scripted alone. Night blanketed the city in quiet anticipation. Across town, the wedding venue was being transformed into a garden fairy tale with string lights, fresh orchids, and champagne-colored drapes. But in Ruth's apartment, there was no excitement, only calm, calculated silence. Her laptop glowed as she completed the final step, scheduling the timed email. At precisely 7 a.m. on the wedding day, the file titled "Truth Behind the Vows" would be sent to Jeremy's parents, several journalists, and select guests who followed his career closely. Attached were the compiled screenshots, timestamps, and a short but pointed message. "You deserve to know the beginning before you celebrate the end." Ruth closed the laptop gently and stared out the window, the weight of what she had done settling over her not as fear, but as quiet freedom. Her phone buzzed. It was Gloria. "Still going through with it," Ruth replied. "Yes. I don't need to ruin their wedding. I just need to make sure they don't rewrite history without me." Gloria sent a voice note instead of texting back. "You're brave, Ruth, but you're also right. What they did, how they did it, it deserves light." Ruth listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the empty tea mug beside her. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt still. Everything had led here. The silence, the lies, the laughter shared by women who believed she was too naive to hear. Ruth stood and walked to her closet, pulling out the bridesmaid dress. She laid it on her bed, ironed and untouched, then reached for her heels. If they expected her to wear a smile tomorrow, she would. But underneath it would be truth, and truth had always been more powerful than tulle. Sunlight filtered gently through the stained glass windows of the church. Guests arrived in tailored suits and flowing gowns, the air thick with admiration and envy. Jeremy stood at the altar in a navy tuxedo, flanked by his groomsmen, checking his watch every few seconds. Ruth, dressed in blush satin, arrived with the bridesmaids, her face serene. As cameras flashed and whispers filled the room, no one noticed the subtle shift in her gaze when she spotted Jeremy. He looked nervous, unsure. She didn't break eye contact as she walked past him toward the bridesmaid pew. Their eyes met for a split second. Jeremy blinked first. Soft music began. The double doors swung open and Agnes appeared, radiant in her gown, veil trailing behind her like a queen's banner. Gasps filled the room. Phones were raised. Ruth didn't move. She watched Agnes glide past each row with pride in every step. But she also saw something else, the tiniest flicker in Jeremy's eyes, the unsettled glance toward the crowd, the tension in his jaw. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Jeremy's mother whispered to her husband, pulling out her phone with a furrowed brow. A few rows behind, a reporter quietly excused himself to take a call. Ruth's heart didn't race, it slowed. The moment had arrived. And though she hadn't spoken a single word, the truth was already echoing in the silence between the notes of the wedding song. The priest's voice reverberated across the high ceiling. "If anyone has any reason these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now." The room held its breath. Agnes turned slightly toward Jeremy, beaming, expecting to hear the final words that would make her a wife. But then soft gasps, a rustling of phones, and one man rising slowly from the third row. It was Keene, the journalist Ruth had entrusted with the story. He didn't speak, but he held his phone high, showing the email now making its rounds on Twitter. Murmurs turned into confusion. Jeremy glanced at his father, who was glaring into his tablet. One guest audibly whispered, "Is this true?" Another added, "It's everywhere." People are retweeting screenshots. Agnes' smile faltered. "What's going on?" she whispered to Jeremy. But Jeremy wasn't listening. His face had turned ghostly pale, eyes locked on the projector screen behind the altar, which had suddenly shifted from the wedding monogram to a headline, "Bride and Groom Built on Betrayal." Ruth remained seated, not flinching as dozens of eyes turned her way. Agnes whirled around, her voice sharp. "Ruth, what is this?" Ruth stood slowly, walked to the aisle, and handed Agnes a sealed envelope. "I didn't write the story," she said calmly. "I just gave the truth a place to breathe." She turned and walked back to her seat as Agnes, trembling, tore open the envelope. Inside were photo prints, annotated conversations, and the dates that told a different love story, one stolen, not stumbled into. The wedding hadn't even ended, but the fairy tale was already in ashes. The air inside the church thickened, silence giving way to murmurs as the truth settled like dust over every pew. Agnes stood frozen at the altar, the envelope still in her trembling hands. The priest looked confused, uncertain whether to proceed or step aside. Jeremy stared blankly at the papers Agnes had dropped, his lips parted but no words forming. Ruth remained composed on the front row, her hands resting gently in her lap. She didn't need to shout. The echo of what had been revealed was louder than any outburst ever could be. One by one, guests stood up and whispered among themselves. Some walked out, others kept filming, and a few, especially the elders, shook their heads in disappointment. Jeremy's father leaned toward his son and whispered something sharp and cold. Jeremy winced. Agnes tried to recover. She stepped forward, voice cracking. "None of this matters. They're old messages. We've moved past it." But Jeremy didn't nod. Instead, he turned to her and asked quietly, "Why didn't you just tell me it started that way?" She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "I didn't know I was walking into a lie until today." The silence that followed was brutal. Ruth stood and walked down the aisle, not to confront, but to bring closure. She stopped beside Agnes, leaned in slightly, and whispered, "You didn't lose Jeremy today. You lost me the night you laughed about stealing him." She looked at Jeremy next. "You were my choice once. But today, I'm glad you made it easy to walk away." And with that, Ruth walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, dignity intact, leaving the ceremony in chaos behind her. Outside, the sun was high, bathing the street in golden warmth as Ruth stepped into it. A few curious onlookers from the media approached, but she waved them off politely. She didn't need a headline or applause. The real victory was the silence that would follow, the way Agnes and Jeremy would now sit with their truth, stripped of illusion. Gloria met her by the car, arms already outstretched. "You did it," she whispered. Ruth nodded. "Not to ruin their day, but to reclaim mine." Gloria handed her a flask of water. "So what now?" Ruth smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now I start over, without pretending, without shrinking." She exhaled deeply. The ache had finally lessened. Back home, Ruth placed the bridesmaid dress into a donation bag and lit a candle by the window, not in memory of Jeremy or Agnes, but for the version of herself she had buried long ago. She opened her journal and wrote a single line. Some vows are never spoken aloud, but they still break when betrayed. Later that night, a text came in from Jeremy. Just one sentence, "I'm sorry." Ruth didn't reply. She turned off her phone and stood in front of her mirror, running her fingers through her hair, free from guilt, free from the past. For the first time in a long time, she saw a woman who had survived betrayal, not by striking back, but by rising through it. She didn't need to destroy anyone. She only needed to find herself again. And now she had. Here's the Bible verse, Luke 8, verse 17 NIV. "For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." This verse speaks directly to Ruth's quiet strength and the eventual unveiling of betrayal. It reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried or masked by appearances, will always find its way to light. Moral of the story: betrayal may dress itself in loyalty, but truth always unmasks it in time. Even in silence, pain can become purpose when handled with grace. Ruth didn't seek revenge, she sought truth. Her dignity became her weapon, and her composure, her justice. This story reminds us that integrity never loses, even when it seems forgotten. The real victory lies not in retaliation, but in rising above the very betrayal meant to break you. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching. Hello family, welcome to Stories with Ma Desi. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The air